Hi guys, welcome to the third lesson of Unit 3. Remember that this unit is all about argumentation, both being able to make an argument, but noticing how other people build their arguments as well. So in lesson 1, we talked about how to notice a person's argument and express that argument. How do we write it down? In lesson 2, we talked about strengthening an argument by appealing to the three different rhetorical appeals: ethos, pathos, and logos. Today, what we're going to be talking about is another way of strengthening an argument, and that is, of course, bringing up evidence. We're going to go over different types of evidence, and we're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each type of evidence. We're also going to talk about how those types of evidence tie back to what we've talked about in the past, especially with ethos and pathos and logos. So if you haven't done those lessons yet, or if you've forgotten, you may want to revisit them before we go on. So what we really need to do when we're thinking about making an argument is we need to be aware of the types of evidence that we can use, and we need to know that each type of evidence comes with a different strength and weakness. And so you need to, number one, you need to know your audience. What's your audience going to find more convincing? And second of all, what is just going to be more, is going to help weigh out your argument a little bit more. So over here we've got the statue of justice, and justice is blind, holding up this, uh, scale. And when we put evidence in the scale, we want that evidence to weigh out equally, right? So we don't want to rely too heavily on any single type of evidence, because it won't weigh if somebody were to bring up another piece of evidence, it wouldn't weigh quite as equally, and then our argument would be weaker. So the four different types of evidence that we could bring up are statistical evidence, testimonial evidence, anecdotal evidence, and analogical evidence. And we want to figure out which of those is going to balance out our argument the best, or what combinations of those are going to balance out our argument the best. So let's first define what each one is, and then figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of it are. So we'll start with statistical evidence. Statistical evidence is numbers and figures. So when you look at a graph, or somebody has, run a scientific study, then you'll get numbers and figures, hopefully defending your argument. So that's statistical evidence. And the strength of statistical evidence is that it allows you to draw logical connections between your argument and the numbers. So you'll be able to say, if this is true because of the numbers, then you should defend my argument. And that's a very logical progression of events, so that's appealing to logos. It's hard to argue with those kinds of facts. The weakness is that it's very impersonal. So somebody who is not very inclined to think logically may not feel strongly about statistical evidence. It's also sometimes hard to explain the connection between statistical evidence and our arguments. And so, while it can be strong, it's not always as strong as you wish it were. So we might then choose to use testimonial evidence as well. Testimonial evidence is expert input. It's not the input of just any Joe Schmo, right? It's expert input. Perhaps it's the person who came up with the statistical evidence in the first place. So if the person who came up with the statistics is also able to provide quotes or additional commentary, then that would be testimonial evidence. And the strength of testimonial evidence is that it comes with the authority of that person's expertise. So that's appealing to ethos, right? If we have both logos in statistical evidence as well as testimonial evidence building up ethos, then that makes testimonial evidence hard to argue with. It's even hard to argue with without the statistical evidence if you're sure to explain what this person's authority is. Unfortunately, there is a downside to testimonial evidence as well, and that is that it can feel oppressive. When you have an authority figure speaking to you or, kind of wielding that authority over you, then some people will push back against that and not find it very convincing. So you have to, not overuse it, especially with people who distrust authority. Um, so you have to, again, consider your audience. Who are you arguing with? Is this going to be effective with them or not? The third type of evidence is anecdotal evidence. And at first it sounds a little bit similar to testimonial, but it's not. So anecdotal evidence is personal stories and experiences. And the reason that this isn't the same as testimonial evidence where you have, an expert, because anecdotal evidence can come from anybody, even somebody who's not an expert. And the point of anecdotal evidence, its real strength is that it's emotionally strong. We're not relying on an expert, we're just relying on a regular person. And that regular person can really appeal to the emotions of the audience, right? They can, when just a normal person is telling a story, we tend to get emotionally involved with that story. And so if we're building that up, then, especially people who are emotionally inclined are going to be more kind of susceptible to falling behind an argument. The weakness is, of course, that stories aren't universal. Statistical evidence and testimonial evidence are speaking to large numbers of people. Statistical evidence is going to require that we, gather a whole bunch of information before we put it out there. Testimonial evidence is going to come from an expert who's looked at tons and tons and tons of different sources, and they're coming from a place of authority. But an anecdote is just one person's experience at a specific time. So they're not universal. They're speaking to one person's experience, not everybody's experience. And so while it may be emotionally convincing, that doesn't mean that everybody is going to have exactly that same experience. So we just have to be careful with, saying just because one person had this experience, just because one person felt this way, doesn't mean that everybody feels that way. The last type of evidence is analogical evidence, and that is when we compare our argument with a similar scenario. It's called an analog in other cases. It's in a lot of times in English class you'll use metaphors as analogs. You could say that uh, writing a thesis is like drawing a map. And the map then is an analog to a thesis. It's the map from the beginning to the end of the paper. So that's what an analog is. It's creating or referencing a similar scenario. In the case of an argument, you're not using a metaphor, you're using another real life example that's similar to the argument that you're making. So the strength of this is that there's a logical connection that connects two separate ideas. It also relies on precedent. So what that means is that you're saying, well, a similar thing has happened in the past, and so here's why it applies to my argument. And it will also sometimes make unexpected connections. So by drawing a connection to something similar that's happened in the past to your argument, then your audience may say, oh yeah, I've never thought of it that way before. Of course, if I agree with that past argument, then I'm more inclined to agree with your current argument. Now, the weakness is that just because they're similar doesn't mean that they're equal. So somebody could argue against an analog by saying, well, yeah, I see the similarities, but that doesn't mean that this is the same thing, right? And we also need to remember that correlation is not causation. Just because something is related doesn't mean that that related thing actually caused or had an effect on the other thing. So we just have to be careful that we're not using analogs as absolutely like the exact same experience. Now there's these four different types of evidence that we can draw on. And obviously we can't just rely on one over the other, because just as we found with the rhetorical appeals, um, everything is stronger when you're trying to combine them. So we really want to make sure that we're using a balance of different types of evidence. We don't want to just use statistical evidence or testimonial evidence or anecdotal evidence, but we want to find that, balance that's appropriate so that we're using different types of evidence. And those different types of evidence are really strengthening our overall argument as a whole. The very last thing that I want to do is just show you how to elaborate on different pieces of evidence depending on what type of evidence we're talking about. So if we go with the same argument that we used in the previous lesson, even though other teenagers aren't always responsible, I'm more responsible than most, therefore you should extend my curfew by an hour. We can look at different uses of the different types of evidence, and we can see how we can build up those complex sentences with the where, the what, and the why or how in order to explain our statistical evidence in a meaningful way, or explain our testimonial or anecdotal or analogical evidence in a very purposeful way. So let's look at how that's done. So if we provided some kind of statistic to defend our argument, we might then explain it this way. My own records show that I have never missed my curfew, and since that's a 100% track record, it therefore proves my responsibility and that I can handle a later curfew. So in this case, we've got a where. We're going back to our own records, which would be our statistical evidence. We've got a what. What are they showing? They're showing that we've never missed our curfew. And why or how is that important? Well, it's important because it proves my track record and my responsibility, and therefore, you can extend my curfew. If we provided testimonial evidence, then we might explain it something more like this. Andrew's mom even said that I would be her first choice in selecting a friend to make sure that her kids got home safe and on time, suggesting that I have a proven track record of reliability to support my request. So in this case, we've got where's the evidence coming from? It's coming from Andrew's mom, and that is, we would assume is a person of authority. What is she saying? She's saying that her first choice, that I'm her first choice in kind of taking care of her kids. So, that's, elaborating on the evidence a bit. Why or how is that important? It's because her authority is proving my track record, right? It's proving that my track record makes me worthy of extending my curfew. If we're using anecdotal evidence, remember anecdotal is a story, but it's not coming from an expert. Then our explanation might look something more like this. Last time I was punished for stepping out of bounds, I cried for 2 weeks, knowing that I disappointed you, and I would never want to put you or myself through that again, which means I'll be extra careful to get you home on time. So this is an anecdote about, the last time that this person making this argument did something bad. So where's that information coming from? It's coming from a personal story, right? What's important about it? The important thing in this case is that they cried for 2 weeks. We're starting to feel that emotion there. Oh my gosh, I feel so bad for you. Why or how is that proving my argument? Well, because we don't want to feel that emotion anymore, and so I'm going to make sure that we don't go through that again. Therefore, you can extend my curfew. Finally, analogical evidence. So a similar situation might look something like this. When I convinced you to start letting me walk to school without you, I proved that I was responsible and careful, and I never once stepped out of line. And I think you should reasonably expect me to hold myself to the same standard here. So in this case, we're talking analog, right? We're talking about a similar situation. Where's that information coming from? Well, it's coming from last time I convinced you to let me do something a little bit more risky, right? So that's the analogical situation. What's going on? Well, or what is it showing? It proved my responsibility. And why or how is that important? Well, if basically because of that last experience and my responsibility, you should trust me that this time will be similar. So these are three different ways to use and elaborate on the four different ways to elaborate and use the four different types of evidence. And you're going to need to look at how each one works differently, how you elaborate on each one slightly differently, and how they could work together in order to make your argument stronger or to make somebody else's argument stronger. And there's the note there that tells you that. So what you're going to be doing now is identifying the different types of evidence in another writer's work. We'll talk about, what of the four types it is. And then I want you to be able to share what you notice in that writer's work with the class.